Hello, Tavarishi, especially to the new ones. Congrats to all of us for becoming 50,000 people strong. So, socialism, communism, anarchism, or radicalism. Your reaction to those words speaks volumes on how much the Red Scare, more commonly known as McCarthyism, influenced your upbringing and perception of politics. As a non-US citizen, my first interaction with this concept came during Bernie Sanders' first election campaign. I noticed, just like many of you most definitely have, that Bernie's self-identification with the word socialist covered headlines left and right in both conservative and liberal media. Almost every interview our socialist Uncle Bernie attended had to include multiple questions on that very word, socialist. Everyone asked him to define how he sees it, to denounce previous attributes given to that word, and to continuously explain why he chose that very scary political identity. Of course, that word raises eyebrows all over the world, don't get me wrong, but nowhere just the same way it does in the US. People might still ask you to further explain what type of socialist you are all over the world, but rarely will they start from the position of fear or disgust to even remotely the same level at which they do in the States. So, I wondered what had to have happened to the American psyche for them to have such disdain to this ideology. Maybe they had a tyrant who called himself socialist and who killed millions of them. Or maybe socialism is antithetical to the American dream. Hell, maybe they were invaded by socialists at some point and are scared of them. Well, turns out when we strip it to bare basics, it was because some man in power told them it's bad and it's out to get them. Yes, jokes aside, this was a massive multi-decade spanning operation of active sabotage and propaganda against an idea which was seen as an unacceptable alternative to the system at the time. An idea which could potentially cost a lot of wealthy people the very tools which allow them to stay in power. This myth-creating, scaremongering machine, built by reactionary, conservative, but also liberal elements of the political elite, kept socialist movements of all stripes and nations back to this very day. A machinery which has taught us, if anything else, that spreading false information is far easier than dismantling it. And before you even think of saying it, yes, things which happened a very long time ago can and do have a massive impact on politics and society in general. Some things just don't want to go away. Look at Jake Paul. While most people link the Red Scare to the beginning of the Cold War as World War II ended, the reality is a bit more complex. Modern historians divide the Red Scare into two parts, the first one occurring during World War I and the other one dominating the Cold War era. On November 7, 1919, raiding parties in 12 US cities composed of federal agents and a motley assortment of local police and American legionnaires descended on the offices of the Union of Russian Workers, an organization of leftist immigrants. The raids coincided with the second anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution and rounded up for the arrest as many as 1,000 people. The largest assault came on January 2, 1920, with raids in some 33 cities aimed mainly at communist groups. But this sustained attack on the left would persist through the middle of February. Dubbed the Palmer Raids, after the man in charge of them, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, a piece of shit, this operation is widely regarded as the definitive event in the nation's first Great Red Scare. Coming only a few months after the communist movement's emergence in the United States and capping off the most tumultuous year of social conflict the country would see all century, the raids were conducted with little concern for constitutional norms. All told, they resulted in the arrest of some 10,000 leftists, hundreds of whom were ultimately deported or criminally prosecuted. This, by itself, if you would allow me to say, is proof that the American government never really fought socialism because of their propagandized vision of the so-called authoritarian nature of the USSR, but quite to the contrary. Anti-socialist rhetoric began the second the socialist project was even remotely seen as a possibility. Anti-communism, at its core, as a policy and worldview, was born not as a movement protecting freedom, but one which quite literally curtailed it. And for what? As cliché as it sounds, the interests of rich people. But the story of the first Red Scare does not end here. Federal Espionage Act was adopted in the early summer of 1917. The law was used to imprison about 200 IWW members, most of them in 3 mass trials. The argument behind these massive crackdowns on one of the world's biggest unions, which was enjoying great success in the US, was that the union members, through protest and sabotage, were aiding Imperial Germany against the US by slowing down local production. Obviously, the historical record not only confirms that these charges were utterly false, it also makes clear that the prosecutions were the work of big capitalists in the West, who conspired with the region's liberal politicians and the current administration to make criminals of much of the union's top leadership. Protests for working conditions, wage improvements, lower work hours, and days off were packaged to look as anti-American and anti-patriotic actions. This, in my humble opinion, my tavarishi, is the first bundling of socialism with anti-Americanism in the country, a tactic which proved so successful that it's being used on a massive scale to this day. State-level criminal syndicalism laws ensued. The first of these was enacted also with strong support from liberals in multiple states in the weeks leading up to the United States' official entry into the war. As the fronts were filling with working-class bodies, as mothers wept for those abroad, they began to weep for the working class at home as well. Union members and reported communists were treated as outlaws. The Red Scare, which had been supposed to end in 1920, showed no signs of stopping. In places where union membership was still strong, like Kansas, Oklahoma, or California, union members were rounded up and prosecuted all the way up until 1924. People were 100% convicted, not because of material evidence, but because of membership in different union or socialist organizations. Lawyers which wanted to defend them were disbarred for unpatriotic practices, like quote-unquote protecting radicals. The criminal syndicalism laws treated a union worse than they treat an organized crime group. To be honest, no wonder why so many kids of IWW union members grew up to be gangsters later in life. But I digress. So what made a syndicate criminal? Well, if you remove the use of violence, the most common argument is advocating for industrial or political change. Freedom of speech. Hey, fellas. The country of supposed rule of law and constitutional principles allowed itself to be subsumed by illogical fears fed to them by a very similar elite their forefathers hoped to be rid of when they founded the very country. As with all people, organizations, and states, our contradictions sometimes begin to define us. And so did the anti-leftist nature of the US begin to change the very principles it pretended to hold for so long, of so-called progress. Said progress no more. After over 20 million Reds bled to defeat fascism, the post-World War II eyes of the American public had to be turned towards a new evil. And why bother with anything new when you can recycle a successful old trend? So, old-school anti-communist hipsters, or their kids who grew up under the previous Red Scare, looked at the big bad East, but no longer in racist fear of the so-called Orient, well, not as much at least, but of the Ruskies, who were no longer monarchist puppets of some demented czars, but a whole new breed, Bolshevik communists. Jealous of no longer being the only country who kicked out their oppressive monarch, the US had to make sure this silly little idea of workers owning their good old means of production never comes to fruition at home, or abroad, or anywhere where there's resources to be privatized, or people to be put into indentured servitude, or where there's nice beaches. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. We need to try and understand the American. I mean, abroad there was this scary so-called worker state, and local workers started thinking, hey, maybe we can do something like that over here. On the other hand, all those slaves they freed are now thinking they deserve rights or something. It really was a time of some heavy-handed SJW nonsense, so the God-fearing American had to do something about it. The anti-communist push began in earnest in 1947, when Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9835, establishing a loyalty oath program for federal employees. It subjected all 2 million federal workers to investigation into their political beliefs in order to determine whether they were members of or even sympathetic to so-called subversive organizations. And yes, this list did include most civil rights organizations. Truman's anti-communist initiatives gave the signal that red hunting was now an official American pastime. And yes, before I get called a subjective leftist in the comment section, it is important to note that while 99% of all arrests, job losses, and prosecutions were totally unfounded or based on anti-leftist suppression, a lot of the paranoia which allowed the Red Scare to grow evolved around a few very specific and real things, like NKVD and KGB spies found in the US, as well as the USSR's development of nuclear weapons, which, for the first time in human history, introduced the idea of potential complete nuclear annihilation. Don't get me wrong, this was the Cold War and an all-out ideological battle. But that is exactly why it is incredibly important to note that the American left of the time did not falter because it was unwanted, but because it was cracked down on unlike any other ideology in the US before or ever since. In the coming years, the one and only undefeated champion of conspiratorial anti-communism, McCarthy of Wisconsin, became the person most closely associated with the anti-communist crusade and with its excesses. McCarthy used hearsay and intimidation to establish himself as a powerful and feared figure in American politics. He leveled charges of disloyalty at celebrities, intellectuals, and anyone who disagreed with his political views, costing many of his victims their reputations, jobs, and even freedoms. McCarthy's reign of terror continued until his colleagues formally denounced his tactics in 1954, when he outdid himself by targeting war heroes. I guess even a brainwashed public had its limits at the time. Not sure we can say the same today. Special attention was paid to the left-led unions. The Taft-Hartley Act required, among other things, that union officers sign affidavits swearing that they were not supporters of the CP and had no relations with organizations advocating for the overthrow of capitalism. If you ever asked yourself why American unions are so apolitical, the answer is rather simple: because they were made to be so. During World War II, the CP had endeared itself to the Union leadership with its militant defense of the no-strike pledge, as necessary for the defeat of fascism. After the war, however, the USSR's geopolitical interests diverged from those of the United States, and many Union leaders were either tossed aside under the new legislature or they betrayed their ideals and joined the Democratic or Republican parties. As CP party and Union members became targets of the entirety of the US government apparatus, more and more attention was directed at black radical and civil rights groups. Before the Red Scare, there was a potent movement for black equality that included the left, most centrally the Communist Party. Based in the new industrial unions, this movement fought for black equality in housing, employment, and at the ballot box, and linked that fight to the broader struggle against capitalist domination. The anti-communist campaign of the late 1940s, however, crippled this movement, delaying the fall of Jim Crow by a decade or more and narrowing the movement's focus to legal equality, leaving its larger ambitions unfulfilled. While even many liberals in the 30s and 40s agreed that racial inequality was intimately bound up with the structure of economic power in American life, the anti-communist crusade had made these sorts of critiques politically radioactive. As the inevitable success of black people's struggle for equal rights became evident, the Red Scare was used to rid the movement of as much socialist and anarchist ideology as possible. Racial equality and class equality had been divorced as political visions. The repression of class radicalism during McCarthyism created a void that has defined the taboo of discussing race and class in the same sentence since. Figures like Roy Innis and Floyd McKissick embraced cultural radicalism before signing on to Richard Nixon's so-called black capitalism. Some of the more serious New Left formations, like the Black Panthers or various new communist movement groupings, attempted to provide an alternative, but their efforts were insufficient to replace the movement destroyed by anti-communism. The second Red Scare succeeded in continuing the troubling efforts of the first. If the first laid a foundation of fear against the unknown, the US government built a Yebeni right-wing skyscraper on top with the second. All discussions of class, of worker and minority solidarity through the vision of international Marxism were now cemented as inherently anti-patriotic, and for the lack of a better word, evil. Quasi-philosophers today keep talking about some sort of free marketplace of ideas. But that, my tavarishi, cannot exist when the conspiracy of so-called evil socialism is so embedded into the minds of multiple American generations that it will take at least another half-century for us to be used to talk about it again, objectively, in the land of burgers. While phobia towards most leftist ideas never really went away since the 60s, the end of the Cold War saw a fall in budgets allocated to actively combat domestic ideological diversity. The big bad enemy was now some people over there in the Middle East, and as Russia was now about to become a capitalist utopia, attention was switched in a rather big way. History had ended, as Fukuyama said. And then it didn't. Today, the US political stage is almost fully characterized through what news anchors like to call political polarization, and what I like to call people being pissed because nothing they were promised is coming to fruition. 65% of Democrats view socialism positively, while only 9% of Republicans hold the same view. As people are seeing through the myth of the American dream and Middle Eastern interventions, the state and corporate apparatus has to find a new type of glue to hold it all together. And as I said previously, why fix something that ain't broken? And a good old Red Scare could do wonders right now. A simple example is the Committee on Present Danger, a long-defunct group that campaigned against the dangers of the Soviet Union back in the 70s and 80s, which has recently been revived with the help of Stephen Bannon, the ex-president's former chief strategist, to warn against the dangers of China. Concerns over China's economic and military boom has very visibly entered into political mainstream, and if Papa YUGOPNIK is going to be right about one thing in this video, expect a lot of China baiting in the future. Expect a lot of socialists to be called traitors and foreign spies. Expect history to repeat in all its awful detail. And that is where we come into question, my friends. No matter what you think about some country half the world over, or about their ideology or the way it's implemented, Red Scare rhetoric is an almost exclusive domestic function. It wants to divide, it wants to confuse, and it wants to rile up hate amongst people who at the end of the day want the same thing. Bernie's defeat came due to multiple factors, but denying that almost half a century of Red Scare ideas aren't fervently present in both the electoral and potentially revolutionary body of the United States would be abhorrently naive. A serious barrier that confronts the American reader who approaches Marxism is the thought that this is a foreign import and has no place in the history, culture, and traditions of the United States, a fabricated myth. And as the American comrades like to say, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Well, Tavarishi, if they fool you 3 times, then I guess it's a shame on the whole movement. We cannot let that happen. Fear towards socialist or anarchist ideas isn't something that comes as a natural fear of change, my Tavarishi. The human experience is defined by our ability to either evolve or degrade as a civilization and a species. We move from system to system, attempting to create something better every time, and for the most part, we succeed. It's in our blood to want to continue this massive historical project. So please, do not accept the concept, even for a second, that revolutionary ideas are something we need to plant into people's heads. No, revolutionary ideas are there until they become suppressed. Fear towards socialism should be analyzed the same way homophobia, xenophobia, or transphobia is. Those are not rational fears born out of some sort of inherently conservative nature. These are semi-conspiratorial, quasi-scientific ideas which have been passed down generation to generation and must be smashed without a smidge of mercy. Well, thank you for making it to the end of the video, Tavarish. If you like what I do here, consider supporting it by subscribing or donating over on Patreon. For the price of less than a can of beer a month, you can help this channel run. Now, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the wonderful Tavarishi without whom this would never have been possible. Especially Deep Red Wine, B. Matt, Soup, Nathan Moore, Luxbeer, Nibino, John T. Fritchie, Aaron Reba, Sophie, Bradley Young, Cap, OT.me, Red Messiah, Ras Peterson, Romaine Bryant, Todd Sprang, Syntax, Hiram, Crouton and Baguette, Alki Historiker, Marussia Asarabakara, Neil Surio, Sam and Eggs, Jess, Austrian Communist, User, Imperator 230, Fellow Worker, Daniel Murphy, Michael Nehoni, Boyan, Elijah Zamora Woolsey, Kamil Piotrowski, Yiddish Commie, Mike Lunning, Chris Anderson, The Muffin Man, Zane Guevara, Kay Eel, Harda Sullivan, Tristan, Bean is Cute.
Più frontiere, sono I confini, rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà, bandiera rossa deve trionfare, bandiera